Hi, welcome everybody. The XFiz guy here, and we're going to be doing a cornerstone topic today for students in exercise science or exercise physiology, or just really anyone who's heard of the values that we see up on the board that we're going to go over. This topic is the Fick equation, and like I said, I really consider it a cornerstone topic, meaning it's one that, especially as a student, you'll have to know throughout all of your schooling and just your entire career in general. Everything is written out on the board already, but I wanted to take the first few minutes to review some vocabulary and some of the abbreviations that are up on the board. I'll go through them one by one. The first one is VO2. VO2 is our abbreviation for oxygen consumption. And in other words, how much oxygen is being taken by the working cells to use to convert fuel. VO2 is the best indicator that we have for overall performance of the human body. It is also the #1 predictor of all-cause mortality, short of being hit by a bus or struck by lightning. So when someone asks you, well, why is VO2 important? You can say VO2 tells us how efficient your system is, and it's a marker for health. So the higher maximum VO2 you can achieve, the more likely you are to ward off chronic disease and remain healthy. The next abbreviation I want to go over is the Q dot. So your Q dot right here. Q dot, when written as such, represents cardiac output. Cardiac output, as defined, is the amount of blood that's ejected by the left ventricle per minute. Typically, for humans at rest, it's roughly 5 to 6 liters per minute, depending on which literature you read. And again, it'll always be abbreviated as Q with a dot on it. I will get into the specifics a little bit more in 1 second. The next one I want to cover is the AVO2 difference, the arterial venous oxygen difference. What this value tells us is the amount of oxygen in the arterial side of the system and the amount of oxygen in the venous side of the system. And I'll go over this example in just a minute as well. A few other ones. HR for heart rate, and heart rate is always the amount of times that the heart completes a cycle in 1 minute, or in other words, the amount of times the heart beats in 1 minute. The last one is SV, which is stroke volume. Stroke volume is defined as the amount of blood that's ejected by the left ventricle per cardiac cycle, whereas cardiac output is the amount of blood ejected by the left ventricle per minute. Stroke volume is the amount of blood ejected by the left ventricle per cardiac cycle. So these components are what make up what is known as the Fick equation for VO2. You'll see the EDV and ESV abbreviations I have over here as well. EDV is end diastolic volume. That is the amount of blood that is in the left ventricle after diastole. So once the ventricle has filled up with blood, that is this number. The end systolic volume is the amount of blood that's left in the left ventricle after a contraction. Because remember, the left ventricle is never going to eject 100% of the blood that is in it. Typically, it'll only eject around 50 to 65% of that blood. And that value is known as the ejection fraction, or is normally abbreviated as EF. That's not going to come really into play too much with the Fick equation. That's another discussion for a different day. Getting back to the Fick equation, VO2, oxygen consumption, is calculated by cardiac output times the arterial venous oxygen difference. And just remember, if you follow this red line, you'll know that cardiac output is the product of the heart rate times the stroke volume. So if you were to theoretically say you had a stroke volume of 100 milliliters and you had a heart rate of 60, then you would have a cardiac output of 6,000. But that's just an example. I'm going to give you another example that will make more sense in a second. So as exercise physiology students, calculating VO2, you will almost never actually use the cardiac output or the VO2 difference. You'll use what are called metabolic calculations or metabolic equations, and that I will do in a whole different series. But for the Fick equation, it's about visualizing and conceptualizing what is going on when we measure VO2. We are measuring cardiac output and the arterial venous oxygen difference. The easiest way that I tell students to think about VO2 is the oxygen consumption. Cardiac output is the amount of blood that is being pumped per minute. Think of that as your quote-unquote delivery. So cardiac output is the delivery of blood to the working tissues. Your arterial venous oxygen difference is the arterial oxygen minus the venous oxygen. Think of this as the quote-unquote extraction of the oxygen by the working tissues. So you have your delivery component and you have your extraction component. And that's really what cardiac output and VO2 difference are measuring, respectively. They're measuring what is the delivery and how much of that delivery is being taken up by the cells. Now, I could go ahead and break down how we make improvements to cardiac output through exercise training, or how we make improvements to VO2 difference in exercise training, but that's really set for another time and place. It's important to understand the physiological concepts behind oxygen consumption, remembering that cardiac output is always the product of heart rate times stroke volume. So again, if we have a typical cardiac output of, let's say, roughly 5 liters per minute, and let's say, for example, that in a resting human, our arterial side of blood will carry 190, let's say, milliliters, and the venous side carries 150 milliliters back to the heart. So this is telling me that if I do 190 minus 150, that 40 mLs was extracted by the working tissue. That 40 would, again, in theory, be plugged in as your VO2 number. So you would actually take your 40 mLs, multiply that by 5, and then you would get 200 over here. Sorry, I'm going to block the board here for 1 second. You get 200. So that's just so you could see how, if you ever did have to calculate it doing it that way, and there are other formulas. If you were to go onto a search engine and type in the formulas for finding oxygen consumption or the formulas for finding cardiac output, you will probably see different equations, these long equations that have arterial oxygen, venous oxygen, and different clearing rates. As exercise science students, we don't deal with those. That's really more for in laboratory studies or in medical science studies. The Fick equation is what we as exercise physiologists would use. So again, if you're a student and you're going through metabolic equations in your classes and saying, well, why do I need to calculate VO2? It's the best overall predictor of all-cause mortality and of fitness. But also, you need to know, again, the physiology of this equation, because if someone really needs to make improvements in their VO2, you can look at it and say, okay, well, where do we make the improvements? Do we make it on the delivery side? Or do we make it on the extraction side? Or do we do it on both? And there's numerous different ways to go about that. So I hope this was a pretty good explanation of oxygen consumption and the Fick equation. If you guys would like to see anything else in relation to this, or you want things broken down a little bit further, just place a comment in the comment section, and I'll be happy to look over it and see if we can go a little bit more further in depth with it. All right, bye.